There's a moment in the life of every collapsing empire when the people who built it stop pretending, when the propaganda stops, when the performance of confidence cracks, and when the words spoken in closed rooms begin to leak out into the world in a form that cannot be walked back. That moment happened in Iran, and it did not come from a dissident blogger hiding behind a VPN. It did not come from an opposition figure broadcasting from exile in London or Los Angeles. It came from inside the Iranian parliament itself, from the very men elected to represent the Islamic Republic, who stood at the podium in session, on the record, and said the words that the regime has spent 40 years trying to prevent any Iranian official from ever saying out loud. The war is lost, not in those exact words. Governments rarely speak that plainly. But in every substantive, consequential, and undeniable way that language functions in political life, that is what was said. And the implications of what was said, who said it, where they said it, and what it means for the 45 million people trapped inside the escalating catastrophe of modern Iran are so profound, so irreversible, and so completely at odds with everything the Islamic Republic has told its population for the past 2 years, that the story demands to be told from the very beginning. Let us start with the number that reframes everything else. The number is 930 billion. That is the figure, denominated in US dollars, that Iranian parliamentary researchers presented in a formal session in May 2026 as the total estimated economic damage to Iran from the combined effects of the military conflict, the US-led naval blockade, and the cascading domestic consequences of both. $930 billion. In a country where the entire pre-war GDP was approximately $367 billion, this is not damage. This is not setback. This is a figure that describes the annihilation of an economy 2.5 times over. To understand how shocking it is for this number to appear in a parliamentary session, you have to understand what Iranian parliamentary sessions have looked like for the past 4 decades. The Islamic Republic's legislature has never been a body of independent oversight. It has been, historically, a carefully managed theater of controlled dissent, a place where disagreements about the pace of implementation of supreme leader directives were permitted, but where fundamental challenges to the legitimacy or competence of the system were not. The fact that parliamentary researchers produced this number and presented it in open session means that someone inside the establishment decided the pretense of winning was more dangerous than the acknowledgement of loss. That is an extraordinary institutional judgment. It means the damage has become so visible, so physically present in the daily lives of ordinary Iranians, that continuing to deny it would destroy whatever credibility the parliament retains as an institution. But the $930 billion figure was not the only thing said. The phrase that sent shockwaves through every government intelligence service monitoring Iranian internal communications was spoken by a parliamentarian whose name, under the circumstances, is less important than the institutional weight of the position from which they spoke. The statement, confirmed by Iran International and cross-referenced against leaked session transcripts circulating through Iranian diaspora networks, was unambiguous. The Islamic Republic does not have the financial, military, or social capacity to continue the current conflict. Let that sentence sit for a moment. This is not an opposition figure. This is not someone the regime could dismiss as a foreign agent or a seditious provocateur. This is a member of the Iranian parliament, a body that, for all its limitations, operates within the formal architecture of the Islamic Republic, saying in recorded session that the state cannot continue fighting. The specific language used invoked 3 dimensions of incapacity that are worth examining individually, because each one reveals a different layer of the catastrophe. The first dimension is financial. Iran's oil export revenues, the primary mechanism through which the state has funded everything from salaries to subsidies to military operations for the past 80 years, have been reduced by approximately 75% since the U.S. naval blockade intensified. The country was exporting roughly 1.71 million barrels per day before the blockade. That figure has collapsed to approximately 567,000 barrels per day. The financial hemorrhage is $500 million per day, every single day. In a country where the government is distributing $7 food coupons to citizens to prevent starvation, in a country where the minimum monthly wage is $130, in a country where inflation has been confirmed by the International Monetary Fund at 68.9% for 2026, with an expected economic contraction of 6.1%, and that estimate was calculated before the blockade reached its current severity. The rial has fallen to 1.32 million per US dollar. A single block of cheese costs $5 in a country where millions of families cannot afford it. The second dimension is military. And this is where the story becomes not just economically shocking, but operationally terrifying, because the military dimension of Iran's incapacity reveals something that no official anywhere, not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not in Brussels, has fully reckoned with publicly yet. Here's a fact about modern military collapse that most people do not know and that military historians spend careers documenting. Armies rarely fail because they run out of weapons. They fail because they run out of money to pay the people holding the weapons. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the paramilitary spine of the Iranian state for 40 years, the organization that built and ran Iran's missile program, its nuclear hedging strategy, its proxy network across the Middle East, its domestic repression apparatus, has not paid its soldiers reliably for months. Internal notices obtained and verified by Iran. International confirmed that members of Iran's police special units had their salary payments disrupted not once, not twice, but 3 consecutive times. The third time, the personnel simply did not show up. Not to protests, not to deployments. They did not arrive because they could not bring food home, and an ideology that cannot pay rent stops functioning as an incentive structure. At one documented base, approximately 350 personnel had abandoned their posts. In some units, the desertion rate has reportedly approached 90%. These are not figures from hostile foreign intelligence services trying to demoralize Iranian troops. These are figures from inside the system, circulating through the internal communications of the institutions themselves. The shocking detail that almost no Western news outlet has reported is this. IRGC personnel have been documented refusing to transport wounded regular Army soldiers to medical facilities, even when hospitals are available and operational. Think about what that behavior signature tells you about an institution. When members of an organization refuse to help the wounded of a nominally allied unit, it does not mean they are brutal. It means the organization has stopped functioning as a unified command and has fragmented into competing factions, each protecting its own resources, each calculating its own survival independently of the institutional mission. That is not a disciplined fighting force. That is a collection of armed men trying to figure out which way to run. Regular Army units on active deployment have been reported operating without adequate supplies of food, water, and ammunition. Air Force pilots have reportedly declined combat missions following the documented loss of aircraft. The military dimension of the parliamentary admission is not rhetoric, it is arithmetic. You cannot fight a war with an army that has not been paid, that is deserting at 90% rates, and whose wounded are being left on the field by their own supposed allies. The third dimension of incapacity acknowledged in the parliamentary session was the one the regime has been most desperate to suppress, because it is the one that directly threatens every single person who has ever held power in the Islamic Republic. The social contract, the implicit arrangement between the state and its population, has not been strained. It has not been tested. It has been shredded, set on fire, and the ashes scattered. The events of January 8th and 9th, 2026 are the essential context here, and they cannot be mentioned without confronting their full scale directly. Between 30,000 and 36,500 Iranian citizens were killed by their own security forces in approximately 48 hours. Not over the course of a suppressed uprising that lasted weeks, in 48 hours. Amnesty International researchers, who have documented every wave of Iranian repression since the revolution, 2009, 2019, 2022, describe the January crackdown as unprecedented in the entire history of their work on Iran. The protests began on December 28, 2025, triggered by economic collapse, specifically by merchants watching the currency disintegrate in real time in Tehran's bazaars. Within 5 days, the uprising had spread to all 31 Iranian provinces simultaneously. Government buildings were stormed in western Iran. Security forces were chased out of Qom, the clerical heartland, the spiritual capital of the theocracy, by crowds chanting slogans that would have been inconceivable a decade earlier. In Lordagan, in Chahar Mahal and Bakhtiari province, neighborhoods became battlegrounds. The regime made its decision, and then it executed that decision with a brutality that has permanently altered the psychological landscape of Iranian society. 2 million people have lost their jobs since the blockade intensified. Urban poverty in Tehran, Mashhad, Avaz, and Karaj has reached a stage that analysts are describing as a complete dissolution of the social contract. Not a widening income gap, not a housing crisis, but a structural collapse of the entire system by which people organize their lives, their families, their sense of what the future might hold. And the parliament, the institution created by the Islamic Republic to give its citizens the illusion of representation, stood up in session and acknowledged that the population's capacity to absorb further suffering has been exhausted. That is what the parliamentary statement meant. Not just that the finances are gone, not just that the army is collapsing, but that the people, the 85 million human beings whose daily reality is defined by the decisions made in Tehran, are at the end of what can be endured. While the parliament was making its admission, something almost more surreal was unfolding at the top of the Iranian power structure. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei rushed into the position following the IRGC commander Ahmad Vahidi and a small circle of senior guard officials have constructed what sources describe as a security cordon around the supreme leader that functions less like protective detail and more like a political quarantine. Official government correspondence intended for the supreme leader is being intercepted. Elected President Masoud Pezeshkian, who won his election in 2025 specifically on a platform of moderation and diplomatic engagement, has reportedly requested urgent meetings with Khamenei on multiple occasions. Every request has gone unanswered. His attempts to appoint a new intelligence minister following the Israeli assassination of his predecessor have been blocked. Every candidate he proposed was rejected by Vahidi on the grounds that wartime conditions require sensitive positions to remain under direct IRGC control. Iran International describes the civilian government as being in a state of complete political deadlock. That is a diplomatic phrase for something far more alarming. The elected government of Iran cannot govern. The man the Iranian constitution designates as supreme leader cannot be reached by the people constitutionally authorized to advise him. The parliament that represents the Iranian people is making formal admissions of military defeat that no one in the IRGC command structure has authorized. What you're watching is not a government under stress. What you're watching is a power structure that is fragmented into competing authorities that no longer coordinate, no longer trust each other, and no longer agree on even the most fundamental question any government must answer. What are we trying to achieve? Here's the detail that explains everything else and that almost no analyst has stated plainly enough. The IRGC has seized control of the Iranian state at the precise moment when controlling the Iranian state is the most dangerous possible position to occupy. The IRGC's entire institutional model was built around perpetual tension. Every time Iran was under external pressure, every round of sanctions, every diplomatic crisis, every military confrontation, the IRGC expanded its economic footprint by crowding out civilian competitors under the justification of national security. The IRGC runs construction conglomerates. It operates telecommunications networks. It has interests in petrochemical facilities and banking. It built an empire by positioning itself as the indispensable guarantor of regime survival. That model works perfectly when the regime survives. But the IRGC has now taken total control of a state that is approaching insolvency while simultaneously losing a war, losing an army, and losing its population. The IRGC command now owns every consequence of every decision. Silent when the final financial artery of the Iranian state is severed, the IRGC will be holding the pen when history writes the cause of death. Worse than December 2025, the IRGC's incentive to accelerate enrichment, to reach nuclear threshold before economic collapse forces a decision, actually increases. A financially bankrupt, internally fragmented, externally blockaded regime controlled by a paramilitary organization whose institutional survival depends on maintaining nuclear threat, operating without functional civilian oversight, with a supreme leader who cannot be reached. That is the nuclear security nightmare scenario that every think tank in Washington and every intelligence agency in Europe has been gaming out in theoretical terms for 20 years. It is no longer theoretical. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian oil exports is not a military campaign in any traditional sense. It is an exercise in applied mathematics, and the math is running out. Iran was pumping crude oil directly into tankers anchored offshore, not as delivery vessels, but as floating storage tanks, because the country cannot afford to stop producing oil. The underground pressure damage from shutting wells improperly is catastrophic and irreversible, and cannot export the oil it is producing. Satellite imagery and Bloomberg Energy Desk analysis calculated that Iran's combined onshore and offshore storage capacity provides somewhere between 14 and 42 days of breathing room. That window is closing. When the floating storage fills and the onshore tanks hit capacity, Iran will have no choice but to shut the wells. When the wells shut, the last functioning financial mechanism of the Iranian state goes dark. Then either a military campaign costing hundreds of billions of dollars, or a negotiated settlement that leaves Iran's fundamental capacities intact. The blockade is not bombing Iran. It is not giving the regime the external attack narrative it has historically used to consolidate domestic support around moments of internal crisis. It is not fire and explosions. It is time and mathematics, and the slow hydraulic pressure of a financial system being drained from the bottom. Every narrative about Iran's position in the global order eventually arrives at Russia and China, because the assumption embedded in that narrative is that Iran has powerful allies who will not permit the Islamic Republic to collapse. That assumption requires serious revision. Russia's relationship with the IRGC-dominated Iranian state was built on a very specific foundation: weapons, energy leverage, and transactions between institutions that operate outside civilian oversight. The Kremlin has never been interested in Iran's civilian population or in Iran's internal political development. It has been interested in Iran as a source of drones for Ukraine, as a client for Russian military equipment, and as a complicating factor in U.S. strategic calculations. A total Iranian state collapse that creates a power vacuum on Russia's southern periphery, adjacent to the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Caspian energy infrastructure, is not something Moscow wants. But Russia cannot afford to rescue Iran. Russia is itself under severe economic strain from its own war and its own sanctions regime. It can absorb discounted Iranian oil when it flows. It cannot inject the hundreds of billions of dollars required to stabilize a collapsing economy. China's calculation is similar. Beijing had been receiving Iranian oil at heavily discounted rates, a critical strategic benefit. A collapsed Iran produces nothing for anyone, including China. But China's interest is in stable supply chains and in maintaining its position as an indispensable economic partner for whoever emerges from the wreckage of the current Iranian state. China is not going to spend its diplomatic capital rescuing an IRGC command structure that is simultaneously torpedoing diplomatic off-ramps and accelerating nuclear enrichment. Beijing will watch, calculate, and position itself to be useful to whatever arrangement follows. Neither Russia nor China will rescue the Islamic Republic. They are strategic spectators calculating which arrangement of the wreckage best serves their interests. The parliamentary admission of defeat in Tehran was not followed by emergency aid from Moscow or Beijing. It was followed by silence. The questions that serious analysts are debating right now are not whether another protest wave comes. The conditions for mass uprising in Iran are objectively worse today than they were in December 2025, when the largest internal challenge to the Islamic Republic since the revolution itself erupted across all 31 provinces simultaneously. The questions are, what form does the next eruption take? And does the security apparatus that massacred 30,000 people in 48 hours retain the capacity, financial, organizational, motivational, to suppress it again? Every indicator points in one direction. Salary delays affecting the third consecutive payment cycle in police special units. Desertion rates approaching 90% in some units. Air Force pilots declining missions. Regular Army running out of food and water. On deployment. IRGC refusing to help the wounded of Allied units. An elected president who cannot get a meeting with the supreme leader. A parliament that has gone on record acknowledging military defeat and economic annihilation. The security apparatus that exists today is not the security apparatus of January 2026. It has been depleted by months of unpaid salaries, by desertion, by the psychological weight of having participated in the killing of tens of thousands of fellow citizens, by the knowledge, visceral and immediate for anyone living through it, that the system they are being asked to defend cannot deliver the basic things that make service worth the cost. An institution that kills 30,000 people to buy one more season has not demonstrated strength. It has demonstrated that consent and legitimacy are gone, and that the only remaining mechanism of control is the willingness of armed men to fire on crowds. When those men stop coming to work, the mechanism fails. The parliamentary admission is not just a political statement. It is a signal, traveling through every level of Iranian society, that the people who built and maintained the system have concluded it cannot continue. That signal does not dissipate. It accumulates. It reaches the soldier who has not been paid for 3 months. It reaches the civil servant calculating whether the job is still worth the moral cost. It reaches the IRGC commander weighing whether loyalty to the institution serves his survival, or whether survival now requires distance from the institution. There is a term in structural engineering called progressive collapse. It describes what happens when a load-bearing element fails, transfers its load to adjacent elements, which then fail in sequence, each failure, accelerating the next until the entire structure comes down not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the cumulative failure of components that were already operating beyond their design capacity. The Iranian economy is failing, transferring its load to the financial system. The financial system is failing, transferring load to the security apparatus. The security apparatus is fracturing, transferring load to the IRGC. The IRGC has seized total power at the moment it is least capable of wielding it, because holding power when the treasury is empty means owning every political and social consequence of the bankruptcy alone, without a civilian government to absorb blame or negotiate exits. The supreme leader cannot be reached. The elected president cannot govern. The parliament has acknowledged defeat. The soldiers have not been paid. The regime that massacred 30,000 of its own citizens in 48 hours to purchase one more season of survival has discovered that seasons have a price, and that the price of the next season is one it can no longer afford to name. History has seen this before. The Soviet Union did not collapse because NATO defeated it militarily. It collapsed because the financial mechanisms holding the loyalty, structure of its governing class, together failed, and the day officials calculated that the system could no longer deliver what it had promised them. The institutional commitment to the system evaporated overnight. The Gaddafi regime, the Assad regime, the Ceausescu regime. In each case, the structure that looked monolithic from the outside was, in reality, a coalition of interests held together by money flows. When the flows stopped, the coalition dissolved. The Iranian parliament has now said, in recorded session, that the flows have stopped, that the war is lost, that the capacity to continue does not exist. What comes next, whether it is a negotiated capitulation, an internal coup by the pragmatist faction of the IRGC, a total state collapse, or a desperate nuclear escalation by commanders who have run out of every other option, will determine not just the future of Iran, but the future of the entire Middle East. 85 million people are living inside that uncertainty right now. The oil storage tanks are filling. The soldiers are going home. The parliament has spoken. And nothing in the region will look the same again.